think everyone can appreciate it's been a peaceful protest, but I think it's time that we ask them to move on.
Occupy evicted. That's the Toronto Mayor, Rob Ford, on what he thinks should be the next step for the Occupy protesters in his city. Last night in London, Ontario, that city became the first Canadian city to force the Occupy camps to pull up stakes after issuing a warning to protesters to remove their tents. By 6 p.m. yesterday, police finally moved into Victoria Park around midnight, took down protesters' tents and loaded other materials into trucks. There was no reported violence. No one was injured, and there were no arrests. But was physically removing the protesters from the park the right thing to do? And as other cities across the country struggle with these Occupy protests, is this something they should consider? Joining me now, the Mayor of London, Ontario, Joe Fontana. Mayor Fontana, last night you took the tents down at Victoria Park in London. You got Toronto's mayor saying today he thinks it's time for the occupiers to move on. Why did you decide to take the Occupy tents down yesterday?
Well, it's always a tough decision on some of these issues, but there came a point in time where it was never an issue of protest and right to speak, but after 16 or 18 days, it became untenable. We couldn't prepare our park for the winter. We couldn't prepare it for events. There was equipment and tents, and our bylaw specifically says that you can't build structures and have equipment between the hours of 10 and 6 a.m. in the morning. It became a situation for health and safety reasons, not only for the occupants, but for people in London, that we needed to issue the order and the notice that the deadline was 6 o'clock, and we left it to our staff and our police to coordinate that. And I must commend the police and our staff for doing a reasoned, balanced, respectful job, as well as commend the occupiers who essentially cooperated with the taking down of the tents.
Concerns raised that you didn't even negotiate with the occupiers before giving the 6 p.m. removal deadline. Did you have talks with them?
Oh, yes. In fact, I think we were the only city that invited them to talk to City Council about some of their issues on homelessness, mental health issues, drugs, poverty, and I challenged them to get involved, to help us work through those issues. It's issues that I'm passionate about too. That we offered up an education tent so that they could continue to raise those awareness and perhaps help them out with regards to the elements. There's been constant dialogue with our mediators, from our police to our staff, over the course of 16 or 17 days. The occupiers were respectful. We had continuing dialogue, and as I've indicated, it was never about the protest. It was about enforcing our bylaw.
But if it was about enforcing your bylaw, why let them protest overnight in the first place? Why wait so many days before enforcing that bylaw?
Well, because we were trying to the dialogue with them, be patient with them, and I think there came a time, though, that all of a sudden that we needed to take control of our park again, and therefore issued the notice. I think we took a very measured response. We entered into dialogue. We could have moved in the day after, but we believe that in entering into those dialogues, to talk with them, to essentially try and find out what those issues are, and in fact, we try and facilitated some of their needs. But so there came a time.
You negotiated with them. You let them speak to council. I mean, you look at cities in the U.S., places like Denver, where the mayor in Denver wanted to negotiate with the Occupy protesters, and said, "Why don't you elect someone so I can speak with them?" And they elected a dog named Shelby. Was there a leadership structure at the Occupy protests in London? Are there people that you could actually negotiate with that had control over the movement there?
No, that was one of the problems, because there was no structured leadership. It all depended on a given day who you were speaking to. There were some spokespeople, but we engaged whomever wanted to speak with us. And as I indicated to you, the result was that I think over the 16 or 17 days, that kind of dialogue led to no arrests, no violence, and a peaceful resolution to the issue. So I can't speak for what works in other cities. I know that we had a strong bylaw. We essentially essentially had the power to do what we did, and that was to give notice, give a deadline, and be able to move and with our staff and with the assistance of the police and essentially remove those tents. And as I've indicated, they're free to be able to protest and to talk about these issues constructively with us, or in fact in our park during the hours of 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. at night.
After the violence you've seen in Vancouver, I mean, police and firefighters there say they've been roughed up. Protesters say the very same thing. Were you worried that there could be violence? And if so, did you have a contingency plan to deal with that?
Well, I'm very proud of our staff and our police. They did it in a very, very professional, respectful, measured manner. I think the fact that we were able to have that dialogue over the past number of days indicated that there was a certain amount of respect on both particular sides, and that's why I think it resulted in a favorable way, understanding full well that these things you never know how they might go, because there were other protesters, there were other people that wanted to engage in the not so much the occupation, but in terms of being able to want to prevent certain things. So I think everything taken into account, I think everybody responded in a very respectful and responsible way.
All right. Now, this is going on in different ways in different cities across the country, Victoria, Halifax, Toronto. Is this the end of the Occupy movement, or do you assume that it will continue in some form?
Well, I can't say whether or not it's the end in other cities, and as I've indicated today, I hope that they come forward with some of their issues. I challenge them to be involved in our engagement process, our working groups, to talk about poverty. We heard firsthand from them, and if they really want to change the world, they can start by in their own community of London, by helping us work through some of these very, very important issues that, as I've said, I and Council and our staff are working towards bettering the lives of an awful lot of people.
But I guess my question is, I mean, you decide to enforce some bylaws because I guess you had a sense that some were saying enough is enough, that the city, that they'd made their point, it was time to enforce the bylaws. Mm-hmm. What's the line when people like the Occupy movement folks, what's the line you think they cross when it's time to enforce your bylaws or take whatever steps you need to do? You brought in a large force of police. You did it non-violently. Nonetheless, what's the line where you say that's it? It's got to stop.
Well, again, when I think you're really concerned about the potential problems with weather, with some of the equipment there, they were using electricity and they were bringing in generators and certain equipment that could have been problematic. We had heard what might have been a problem in other particular cities, and obviously we were having trouble, in fact, preparing our park and with certain damage being caused. So that tipping point came when we were really worried about the health and safety of not only the occupants, but people that wanted to use their parks. So again, we were measured, we were patient, but at some point, and I think I told you what that point was, that City Council moved decisively, and therefore we had to move, and it worked out all right. Now the next steps are much more important to me as to how we can move forward in continuing the dialogue and looking for solutions.
Mayor Fontana, thanks so much for joining us today. I appreciate that.
Take care, Evan.